Some places are not meant to be sold. Not until you hear what they remember. The night before the funeral, Ethan Walker didn't sleep. His truck was parked along a narrow gravel road just outside the small cemetery, engine long gone cold, the world wrapped in a quiet that felt heavier than silence. A thin layer of frost clung to the windshield, turning the distant pine trees into blurred shadows under the dim glow of a single street lamp. Beside him, Ranger sat upright in the passenger seat, ears alert, amber eyes fixed on something Ethan couldn't see. The envelope lay unopened on the dashboard, its edges worn, his grandmother's handwriting faint but steady even in the low light. Ethan had carried it all day without reading it, as if opening it would make everything final. The wind moved softly through the trees, carrying the scent of cold earth and pine resin, and somewhere in that quiet, Ranger let out a low, uneasy breath. Ethan finally reached forward, fingers rough and hesitant, and broke the seal. Inside was a single brass key, old and heavy, the kind that didn't belong to anything modern, along with a folded note. He read it once, then again, slower this time. Don't sell the place before you hear what the walls remember. That was all. No explanation. No instructions. Just that one sentence, written in the same careful script she used when he was a boy learning how to spell his name at her kitchen table. Ethan leaned back against the seat, exhaling slowly, his breath fogging the glass. The place, he murmured under his breath, though he already knew what she meant. The Ashcroft Hotel. 24 rooms of aging wood and quiet hallways, sitting at the edge of silver pines like something the town had forgotten but never quite let go of. He hadn't been back there in years. Not since before the war. Not since before everything had changed. Ranger shifted beside him, nose lifting slightly, then nudged the key with a soft push of his snout, as if urging him forward. Ethan glanced at the dog, a faint, tired smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. You always did know when something mattered, didn't you? The dog's ears flicked, his gaze steady, patient. Outside, the wind stirred again, brushing through the trees with a sound that almost felt like a whisper. Ethan looked back down at the key resting in his hand, its cold weight grounding him in a way nothing else had all day. He hadn't come here looking for anything. Not answers. Not purpose. Certainly not a future tied to a place he had once been so determined to leave behind. But sitting there in the quiet, with the night pressing gently against the truck and the last words of the only person who had never given up on him echoing in his mind, he began to understand something he hadn't expected. Maybe this wasn't about what she left him. Maybe it was about why she believed he would come back at all. By morning, the frost had thinned into a pale shimmer across the road, and the sky above the trees stretched wide and colorless, like a sheet of glass waiting for something to be written on it. Ethan started the truck without a word, the engine coughing once before settling into a low, steady hum, and Ranger shifted in his seat, as if he already understood where they were going. The road into Silver Pines had not changed much over the years, still narrow, still winding, lined with tall pines that leaned inward like quiet witnesses to every passing season. As the truck rolled forward, gravel crunching beneath the tires, Ethan kept one hand on the wheel and the other resting lightly on the brass key in his pocket, feeling its weight with every mile as if it were measuring something deeper than distance. They passed the old gas station first, its sign faded and half-lit, then the small diner with its fogged windows and the faint outline of early morning coffee drinkers inside, people who had probably lived their entire lives within these same few streets. No one waved. No one needed to. This was the kind of town where recognition did not always come with words, and absence was remembered longer than presence. Ethan slowed as the road curved toward the edge of town, where the trees thinned and the land opened into a wide, quiet stretch overlooking a frozen lake. And there it was. The Ashcroft Hotel stood at the far end of the clearing, its shape rising from the earth like something that had been built with patience and then left behind without explanation. 3 stories of weathered wood and stone, 24. Windows staring outward like tired eyes, some dark, some catching the pale light of morning in a way that made them seem almost awake. The front porch sagged slightly on one side, the railing worn smooth by years of use, and the old sign above the entrance hung crooked, its lettering still visible beneath layers of time and weather. Ethan parked the truck a few yards away and cut the engine, and for a moment neither he nor Ranger moved. The silence here felt different from the one at the cemetery. It was not empty. It carried something with it, something settled into the walls and the ground, something that had not left even when everything else had. Ranger was the first to step down, landing softly on the frost-covered dirt, his nose already lifting toward the building, ears forward, body alert but not tense. Ethan followed more slowly, boots pressing into the thin crust of ice as he took in the place he had once known so well, and yet now felt like a stranger standing outside his own memory. The front door was still the same heavy oak, its surface marked by faint scratches and years of weather, and the brass handle matched the key in his pocket with an exactness that made his chest tighten before he even reached for it. Ranger stopped just short of the steps, glancing back once as if to make sure Ethan was still there, then turned again toward the entrance, his gaze fixed and steady. Ethan climbed the porch, each step giving a soft creak beneath his weight, and stood for a moment in front of the door, his reflection faint in the glass panel. He could almost hear her voice then, not as a memory, but as something carried in the air, calm and certain the way it had always been. He took the key from his pocket, the metal cool against his fingers, and slid it into the lock. It turned without resistance. The door opened with a slow, quiet sound, and a breath of cold air drifted out from the darkness inside, carrying with it the scent of old wood, dust, and something else beneath it, something warmer, like the faint trace of a fire that had once burned long enough to matter. Ranger stepped forward first, crossing the threshold without hesitation, his paws soft against the worn floorboards, and then Ethan followed, closing the door gently behind him as the outside light narrowed into a thin line and disappeared. Inside, the hotel did not feel abandoned. It felt paused, as if it had been waiting for someone to return and remember how to listen. The air inside carried a stillness that did not belong to neglect but to memory, the kind that settled into wood and walls and waited without impatience. And as Ethan stepped deeper into the lobby, his boots echoed softly against the floorboards, each sound folding into the next, as if the building itself was listening to his return. Dust rested in thin layers along the front desk and the banister, yet it was not the thick, forgotten kind that comes from years of abandonment. It felt lighter, disturbed in places, as though someone had passed through not long ago, or perhaps as though time here had chosen to move differently. Ranger moved ahead with quiet purpose, his nails clicking faintly as he crossed the lobby, pausing once near the old reception counter where a brass bell sat slightly tilted, then lifting his head toward the staircase that rose along the far wall. His ears stood tall, not in alarm but in focus, and a low breath left his chest as if he were catching something just beyond sound. Ethan followed his gaze, eyes tracing the staircase upward into the dimness of the second floor, where shadows gathered along the railing and the hallway beyond disappeared into a soft gray hush. "You hear something, boy," he murmured, though the question carried no urgency, only curiosity shaped by long habit, the kind that came from trusting the instincts of the one creature who had never failed him. Ranger did not bark, not yet, but he held his position at the base of the stairs, body still, attention fixed as though the space above them was not empty, but simply waiting to be understood. Ethan let his hand rest along the wooden post of the banister, feeling the grain beneath his fingers, worn smooth in places, nicked in others, each mark a quiet record of hands that had come before him. And for a brief moment the image of his grandmother moved through his mind with a clarity that surprised him, her small frame standing behind this very desk, her voice steady, her presence filling the space in a way that made even strangers feel as though they had arrived somewhere meant for them. He stepped toward the counter, brushing his fingers across its surface, and found beneath the thin dust a faint warmth, not in temperature but in memory, as though the place had not forgotten the rhythm of being used. The guest ledger still lay open, pages yellowed but intact, names written in careful script stretching back years, some familiar, some not, each one a story that had passed through these doors and left something behind. Ethan flipped a page slowly, then another, noticing how many entries were marked not with room numbers or prices, but with small notes in the margin, simple words written in his grandmother's hand. "Stay as long as needed. No charge. Come back in spring." He exhaled quietly, the weight of those words settling deeper than he expected, And when he looked up again, Ranger had moved, climbing the first few steps of the staircase with measured certainty before stopping halfway and turning back to meet Ethan's eyes. There was something different in that look, something deliberate, as if the dog was not just reacting but guiding, inviting him forward without force. Ethan hesitated only a second before following, each step creaking softly beneath his weight, the sound traveling upward and fading into the corridor above. And as he reached the top, the air shifted slightly, cooler, thinner, carrying a faint scent of linen and old wood, and something else beneath it, something that felt almost like the echo of voices long gone quiet. The hallway stretched out before them, lined with closed doors, each one bearing a small brass number dulled by time. And though nothing moved and no sound broke the silence, the place did not feel empty. It felt occupied in a way that did not require presence, as if every room still held the shape of those who had once rested inside. Ranger walked slowly along the corridor, stopping near the middle where the number 214 hung slightly crooked on its nail. And this time he let out a single, low bark, not loud, not sharp, but clear enough to settle into the space between them like a signal that had finally found its moment. Ethan stood still, eyes fixed on the door, his hand tightening slightly at his side as something quiet and undeniable rose in his chest, the sense that whatever waited behind that door was not random, not forgotten, but placed there with intention, left for a day that had always been meant to arrive. The door to room 214 did not open at first, not because it was locked, but because it resisted in a way that felt almost deliberate, the wood pressing faintly against the frame as if holding on to something behind it that had not yet decided to let go. Ethan rested his hand on the brass handle, feeling the cool metal against his palm, and for a brief moment he simply stood there, listening to the quiet that had settled around him, a quiet that did not feel empty but attentive, as though the hallway itself had leaned in to witness what would happen next. Ranger stood close at his side, body still, ears forward, his gaze fixed on the door with an intensity that carried no fear, only recognition. Ethan drew in a slow breath and pushed again, firmer this time, and the door gave way with a soft, reluctant creak that echoed down the corridor like a memory unfolding. The room beyond was dim, the curtains drawn halfway across the tall window, allowing a narrow ribbon of gray morning light to slip through and stretch across the floorboards in a thin, steady line. Dust floated in the air, turning slowly in that light, but beneath it the room felt preserved rather than abandoned, as though it had been closed carefully, intentionally, waiting for a return that had taken longer than expected. Ranger stepped inside first, moving with measured steps across the worn rug before stopping near the center of the room and lowering his head slightly, nose hovering just above the floor as if tracing something unseen. Ethan followed, the door settling shut behind him with a quiet finality, and as his eyes adjusted he began to take in the details one by one. The neatly made bed with its folded quilt, the small writing desk placed near the window, the chair tucked in with care, everything arranged with a kind of order that spoke of someone who believed this space mattered. On the desk sat a wooden box, simple in design but polished smooth from years of use, its lid slightly ajar as though it had been closed in haste, or perhaps left open on purpose. Ethan approached slowly, each step carrying a weight he could not fully explain, and when he reached the desk he paused again, his hand hovering just above the box before finally lifting the lid the rest of the way. Inside were letters, dozens of them, bundled neatly with faded ribbons, each one addressed in different handwriting, some careful and precise, others uneven and hurried, but all carrying a presence that felt immediate despite the years that had passed. Ranger shifted beside him, letting out a soft breath, then settled onto the floor as if he understood that whatever was happening now required stillness. Ethan picked up the top bundle, fingers brushing against the paper, and unfolded the first letter with a care that bordered on reverence. The ink had softened with time, but the words remained clear enough to read, and as his eyes moved across the page, something inside him began to shift. It was a thank you, simple in its phrasing, written by a man who had come through this place during a winter much colder than this one, a man who had arrived with nothing but had been given a room, a meal, and the quiet permission to rest without being asked for anything in return. Ethan read another, then another, each letter telling a different story but carrying the same thread. People who had passed through these walls at their lowest, and had been met not with questions or conditions, but with a kind of understanding that did not need to be explained. Some mentioned his grandmother by name. Others simply called her the woman who kept the light on, the one who did not turn anyone away, the one who seemed to know what a person needed before they found the words to ask. Ethan swallowed slowly, the room around him growing heavier not with sorrow, but with something deeper, something that felt like a truth he had never fully seen until now. On the inside of the box lid, written in the same steady script he had known all his life, was a single line that stopped him where he stood. Not every wound asks to be fixed. Some only ask for a place to rest. He closed his eyes for a moment, the words settling into him in a way nothing else had since the night before. And when he opened them again, the room did not feel like a relic or a burden. It felt like a promise waiting to be understood. Ranger lifted his head then, meeting Ethan's gaze with a quiet certainty, as if to say that this, whatever it was, had never been about the building itself. It had always been about what it held, and what it was still ready to give. The letters did not end where Ethan expected them to, and as he set the last bundle back into the wooden box, something within him resisted closing the lid, as though the act itself would seal away a truth he had only just begun to understand. Ranger remained still on the floor, but his eyes followed Ethan's every movement, calm and steady, as if he already knew there was more to be found. Ethan's gaze drifted across the desk again, slower this time, noticing details he had missed before, the faint scratches along the wood, the indentation where something heavier had rested for years, and just beneath the edge of the desk, barely visible in the dim light, a narrow seam that did not belong to the rest of the structure. He crouched down, running his fingers along the underside, and felt it then, a small latch hidden flush against the wood, subtle enough to escape notice unless someone was looking for it. He hesitated only briefly before pressing it, and with a soft click, a shallow compartment slid open, revealing a single leather-bound journal tucked neatly inside. The cover was worn, its edges softened by time, but there was no mistaking whose it had been. Ethan lifted it carefully, the weight of it surprising him in a way that felt almost symbolic, as if it carried more than just pages. When he opened it, the scent of old paper and ink rose faintly, and the handwriting inside was unmistakable, the same steady, patient script that had once guided his small hands across lined notebooks at a kitchen table filled with morning light. He turned the first page slowly, and there, dated nearly 10 years back, was an entry that did not begin with a description of the hotel or its upkeep, but with his name. Ethan came home today, but only in body. The rest of him is still somewhere far away, where silence is heavier than words. He exhaled softly, the words settling into him with a quiet force, and as he continued reading, the entries unfolded not as records of a business, but as reflections, observations, small moments written down with care, each one capturing something he had not realized she had seen. She wrote about the way he avoided eye contact when people asked how he was doing, about the way his shoulders carried a tension that never fully eased, about how he would sit on the back steps in the evening with Ranger, saying nothing, yet staying there longer than necessary, as if waiting for something he could not name. Ethan swallowed, his thumb resting along the edge of the page, and for the first time since stepping into the hotel, he felt not like an owner or an outsider, but like someone being gently, unmistakably understood. The entries moved forward through the years, each one tracing a quiet hope that he might return not just to the building, but to himself. One day he will come back, she had written. Not because he has nowhere else to go, but because he is ready to stay. Ethan closed his eyes briefly, the words echoing in a place deeper than thought, and when he opened them again, he turned to the final pages. The handwriting there was slightly less steady, the lines spaced a bit wider, but the intent remained clear. If you are reading this, then you have already crossed the hardest distance, it said. This place was never meant to make money. It was meant to hold people until they remembered how to stand again. You do not need to fix them. You only need to keep the door open. The room fell quiet around him in a way that felt fuller than before, as if the walls themselves had drawn closer, not to confine, but to listen. Ranger rose then, stepping forward to rest his head gently against Ethan's leg. a silent gesture that carried more certainty than any words could. Ethan looked down at him, then back at the journal in his hands, and something within him shifted, not all at once, not with any dramatic clarity, but in the slow, steady way that real change often arrives, like light returning at the edge of a long winter. He had come here thinking he was inheriting a building, a responsibility he might not be able to carry, but standing there in that quiet room, with the weight of her words still settling into him, he began to understand that what she had left behind was not something to manage or restore. It was something to continue, something that had already begun long before he was ready to see it, and something that, somehow, had been waiting for him all along. The journal remained open in Ethan's hands long after he had finished reading, not because there were more words left to see, but because something inside him had not yet caught up with what those words had already begun to change. The room around him felt quieter now, not empty, but settled, as though it had finally been heard. Ranger stepped back from his side and moved toward the doorway, pausing once to glance over his shoulder, a silent invitation that felt both simple and certain. Ethan closed the journal carefully and placed it back into the hidden compartment, sliding the panel shut until it rested seamlessly against the wood once more, the way it had for years. Then he followed. The hallway seemed longer on the way out, the light shifting subtly as the morning grew stronger beyond the windows, and for the first time since arriving, Ethan noticed the faint warmth beginning to push against the cold that had lingered in the building. It was not much, just a hint, but it was enough to suggest that something here was beginning to wake. Ranger led him down the stairs and into the lobby, where the stillness had softened, the space no longer feeling paused but in transition, as if the building itself had taken a quiet breath. Ethan moved toward the front windows and pushed aside the curtain just enough to let more light spill in, the pale winter sun stretching across the floorboards and catching on the dust in a way that made it seem less like neglect and more like time, simply waiting for motion to return. Outside, the town had begun its day, faint movement visible along the road, a passing truck, a figure crossing the street near the diner, life continuing as it always had, unaware that something within these walls had shifted. Ethan stood there for a moment, his reflection faint in the glass, and for the first time the thought came not as a question, but as a possibility. What if he stayed? The idea did not arrive with certainty, nor did it carry any promise of ease, but it did not feel impossible either. Behind him, Ranger's nails tapped softly against the floor as he moved toward the front desk again, stopping beside the old brass bell and nudging it lightly with his nose. The bell gave a soft, clear chime, its sound cutting through the quiet with a brightness that lingered longer than expected. Ethan turned at that, his eyes settling on the desk, the ledger, the space where so many names had been written without expectation of return. He walked back slowly, resting his hand on the counter, and looked down at the open page. The last entry, dated months ago, was written in his grandmother's hand, the ink slightly faded but still steady. There was no guest name beside it, no room number, just a single line written across the page. Keep the door open. Ethan exhaled softly, the words landing differently now than they might have before, no longer abstract, no longer distant. They felt immediate, real. Outside, a car passed by more slowly this time, its tires crunching over gravel, and then came the faint sound of an engine idling just beyond the front steps. Ranger's head lifted instantly, ears forward, his body shifting into that familiar alertness that Ethan had learned never to ignore. The dog moved toward the door without hesitation, stopping just short of it, his gaze fixed, his tail still, as though he sensed something about to cross the threshold that mattered. Ethan felt it too, not as a sound, not as a clear sign, but as a subtle change in the air, a quiet anticipation that seemed to gather in the space between one moment and the next. He stepped forward, his hand reaching for the door handle, pausing there for just a second as the weight of everything he had read, everything he had felt, settled into a single, simple understanding. This place had never been waiting for repairs. It had been waiting for him to decide whether he would open the door. And for the first time, he did not hesitate. The door opened slowly, the hinges giving a soft, tired sigh as if they had not been asked to move in some time, and the cold air from outside slipped into the lobby in a quiet rush that carried with it the scent of pine, gravel, and something faintly metallic from the road. Ethan stepped back just enough to make space, his hand still resting on the handle, and Ranger moved first, crossing the threshold with a calm, deliberate stride, his posture alert but not tense, as though he already understood that whoever stood on the other side did not bring danger, only something that needed to be seen. A woman stood a few feet from the porch, her coat pulled tight around her, strands of gray hair brushing against her face in the morning wind. She looked to be in her late 60s, her frame slight but steady, her eyes carrying a kind of quiet exhaustion that did not come from a single moment, but from years that had not offered much rest. In her hands, she held a small canvas bag, worn at the edges, the kind that had been used long enough to hold more than just what was visible. She hesitated when the door opened fully, her gaze shifting from Ethan to Ranger and then back again, as if trying to decide whether she had come to the right place or arrived too late for something she did not fully understand. Ethan did not speak right away. He simply stepped aside, the gesture small but clear, leaving the doorway open behind him. The woman glanced past him into the lobby, her eyes lingering on the front desk, the staircase, the soft light now stretching across the floor, and something in her expression changed, not dramatically, but enough to suggest recognition, or perhaps relief that she had not expected to feel. "I am sorry," she said after a moment, her voice quiet, steady but edged with hesitation. "I did not know if this place was still," she trailed off, the words unfinished, as if the question itself did not need to be spoken. Ethan nodded once, his voice low when he answered. "It is." The words settled into the space between them, simple, unadorned, but carrying a weight that neither of them questioned. Ranger stepped closer to the woman then, his nose lifting slightly as he took in her scent, his tail giving a small, measured movement that spoke of acceptance rather than curiosity. The woman looked down at him, a faint, almost fragile smile touching her lips, and for a moment her shoulders seemed to ease, as though the presence of the dog had answered something she had not known how to ask. She stepped forward slowly, crossing the porch and entering the lobby with a careful awareness, her boots soft against the floorboards, her gaze moving from one corner of the room to another as if searching for something familiar among the quiet. "I stayed here once," she said, almost to herself, her eyes resting on the front desk. "A long time ago. Your grandmother." She paused, her voice catching not with pain, but with memory. "She let me stay when I had nowhere else to go." Ethan felt the words land in him with a quiet clarity, not as something new, but as something that confirmed what he had already begun to understand. He nodded again, this time more slowly, his hand resting lightly against the counter as he looked at her. "Then you are welcome here again." The woman exhaled, a breath she seemed to have been holding longer than she realized, and for a moment the room held a stillness that felt fuller than before, not empty, not waiting, but beginning. Outside, the wind moved gently through the trees, brushing against the building in a way that sounded less like pressure and more like presence. And inside, the light continued to spread across the floor, touching the edges of the desk, the base of the stairs, the place where Ranger now sat quietly beside the woman as if he had been expecting her all along. Ethan looked around the lobby, at the ledger, the bell, the door still open behind them, and something within him settled into place. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough to move forward. This was how it began, not with certainty, not with a plan, but with a single person stepping through a door that had been left open, and someone choosing, without hesitation, to let them stay. The morning passed without urgency, as if time itself had chosen to move more gently within those walls, and by early afternoon the light had shifted from pale gray to a soft, steady gold that settled into every corner of the lobby. The woman sat quietly near the front window, her canvas bag resting at her feet, her hands folded loosely in her lap as she watched the slow movement of the town beyond the glass. She had given her name only once, Margaret, spoken with a simplicity that suggested she did not expect it to carry weight, yet somehow it did. Ethan had shown her to one of the rooms on the first floor, a smaller one near the back where the window looked out toward the line of trees, and though the bed needed fresh linens and the air still held a faint chill, she had stepped inside with a kind of quiet gratitude that required no explanation. Ranger had followed her to the doorway, pausing there as she settled her bag down, his presence steady, as if marking the space as safe before returning to Ethan's side. The hours that followed unfolded without structure, yet nothing felt uncertain. Ethan moved through the building with a new awareness, opening windows, letting in air that carried the scent of pine and distant water, brushing dust from surfaces not with urgency, but with care, as though each small action mattered more than the result. In the kitchen, he found what remained of supplies, a few cans, a bag of rice, coffee sealed tightly in a jar, and he set water to boil on the old stove, the flame catching after a brief hesitation, the sound of it filling the space with a quiet warmth that had been missing for too long. When he brought a cup to Margaret, she accepted it with both hands, her fingers lingering against the warmth as if it anchored her to the moment, and for a while they sat without speaking, the silence between them not empty, but shared. Outside, clouds began to gather slowly, the sky dimming in a way that hinted at weather turning, and by late afternoon the wind had picked up, moving through the trees with a deeper voice, pressing softly against the sides of the building. Ranger noticed it first, lifting his head from where he lay near the front desk, ears angling toward the shifting sound, his body alert but calm. Ethan glanced toward the windows, watching as the light faded more quickly than expected, and something in the air changed, not in a way that brought concern, but in a way that felt like a beginning. The first knock came just as the sky darkened, soft but clear against the front door, and Ranger was already on his feet before the second followed. Ethan crossed the room, his step steady, and opened the door to find a man standing there, his jacket pulled tight against the wind, his face lined with fatigue that mirrored something Ethan recognized too well. He did not speak immediately, only looked past Ethan into the lobby, his eyes lingering on the light, the warmth, the presence of something that did not ask questions before offering space. Ethan stepped aside, the gesture as natural as breath, and the man entered without hesitation, nodding once in quiet thanks. Not long after, another car pulled up, then another, each arrival carrying a different story, a different kind of weariness, yet all drawn by something none of them seemed to fully understand. Margaret remained by the window, watching as the room slowly filled, her expression softening with each new presence, as if she were witnessing something she had once known and feared had disappeared. Ethan moved between them without urgency, offering coffee, showing rooms, adjusting blankets, his actions simple, deliberate, guided not by instruction but by something that had already taken root. Ranger moved as well, greeting each person in his quiet way, his calm presence settling the space, his instincts guiding him from one moment to the next with a certainty that needed no explanation. By evening, the storm had arrived in full, rain tapping steadily against the windows, wind pressing against the walls, yet inside the building there was warmth, light, and the quiet rhythm of people finding rest. Ethan stood for a moment near the front desk, looking out across the lobby, at the figures seated, at the movement, at the life returning to a place that had never truly been empty, and he understood then, not as an idea, but as something real and immediate, that this was not something he had created. It was something he had chosen to continue. And sometimes, that was enough to change everything. The storm did not leave quickly, and through the night it pressed steadily against the windows and roof, its rhythm settling into something almost comforting, like a reminder that the world outside still moved even as the space within held stillness for those who needed it. Inside, the rooms filled one by one, not with noise, but with presence, quiet footsteps in the hallways, the soft closing of doors, the low murmur of voices that did not need to rise to be heard. Ethan moved through it all with a calm that felt unfamiliar at first, yet natural in a way he could not deny, checking the furnace, adjusting blankets, leaving small lamps on in rooms where the light felt too dim, each action simple, each one enough. Ranger stayed close, sometimes resting near the front desk, sometimes walking the corridors with a quiet watchfulness, pausing at certain doors as if listening, then moving on when whatever he sensed settled into peace. By morning, the storm had softened, the rain easing into a gentle drizzle that tapped lightly against the glass, and a pale light returned to the sky, filtering through the clouds in a way that made everything outside appear washed clean, quieter, as though the world had taken a breath it had been holding for too long. One by one, the guests began to emerge from their rooms, not all at once, not in a rush, but gradually, each person carrying a different expression, some still tired, some more at ease, but all changed in small ways that did not need to be named. Margaret came down the stairs slowly, her hand resting lightly on the railing, her eyes moving across the lobby as if seeing it anew. And when she reached the bottom, she paused near the front desk where Ethan stood, a cup of coffee already waiting for her. She accepted it with a quiet nod, her fingers steady now, her shoulders no longer carrying the same weight they had the day before. "It feels different here," she said softly, not as a question, but as an observation that did not need confirmation. Ethan glanced around the room, at the light, at the people, at Ranger lying nearby with his head resting on his paws, and he gave a small nod. "It always did," he replied, his voice calm, grounded in something that had settled within him overnight. The others lingered for a while, some sharing quiet conversations, others simply sitting in the warmth, not eager to leave. Not yet, and when they did step outside, it was with a kind of unspoken understanding, a pause at the door, a glance back, as if marking the place in their memory before returning to whatever waited beyond it. No one asked about payment. No one mentioned cost. It did not feel necessary. By midday, the lobby had grown quiet again. The rooms empty but no longer hollow. The air holding a different kind of stillness now, one that felt lived in, touched, continued. Ethan stepped outside onto the porch, the wood damp beneath his boots, and looked out across the clearing where the lake stretched beyond the trees, its surface reflecting the muted light of the clearing sky. The sign above the entrance shifted slightly in the breeze, its old lettering worn but still visible, and for a moment he considered leaving it as it was, unchanged, a piece of the past held steady. But then he reached up and steadied it, not to replace it, not yet, but to straighten it, to give it a small adjustment that felt like a beginning rather than an ending. Ranger stepped out beside him, sitting quietly at the edge of the porch, his gaze moving across the same view, his presence as constant as the breath in Ethan's chest. Inside, the ledger remained open on the front desk, the last written line still resting on the page, and after a moment, Ethan turned back, walked inside, and picked up the pen. He did not rush. He let the quiet settle around him, let the weight of the moment take shape in its own time, and then he wrote a single entry beneath his grandmother's last words, the ink fresh, steady. "The door is open." He set the pen down gently, his hand lingering for a moment on the page, and then stepped back, looking at the words not as a statement, but as a promise he had already begun to keep. Outside, the clouds continued to part, thin lines of sunlight breaking through and stretching across the land, touching the roof, the porch, the windows, and inside. The light followed, filling the space in a way that felt both new and familiar at once. Ethan stood there for a while, saying nothing, needing nothing more, and in that quiet, he understood something that had taken him years to reach, something that could not be forced or hurried, only lived. He had not come back to rebuild what was lost. He had come back to remain, to hold the space his grandmother had once held, not perfectly, not completely, but honestly, and sometimes that was all a place needed to begin again. Ranger lifted his head slightly, watching the door, listening to the world beyond it, and though no one stood there now, the sense of something approaching remained, not urgent, not demanding, but certain. Because some doors, once opened, are never meant to close again.